Chapter 10. At 7 a.m, Kim stood before the headstone and pulled the leather jacket tightly around herself. On top of the rolly hill, dominated by Pauk Lane Cemetery, the wind howled around her. It was Saturday, and she always made time for family on a Saturday, new case or not. Grave markers still bore the debris of Christmas gifts left by the living guilty, wreaths reduced to skeletal twigs, poinsettias battered into wilted submission by the weather. A layer of frost glistened on top of the imperial red stone. From the moment she'd found the simple wooden cross marking the space, she had saved as much as she could from her 2 jobs and bought the stone. It had been installed 2 days after her 18th birthday. Kim gazed at the sparse gold lettering, all she'd been able to afford back then, a simple name and 2 dates. As usual, she was struck by the distance between the 2 years engraved, no more than a blink. She kissed her fingers and placed them firmly against the cold stone. Good night, sweet Mikey. Sleep tight. The tears stung her eyes, but she fought them back. They were the same words she had spoken right before the last breath had left his fragile, defeated body. Kim put the memory safely back into the box and donned her helmet. She pushed the Kawasaki Ninja to the exit gate. There was something disrespectful about igniting the roar of the 1400cc engine within the confines of the cemetery. A metre out, and she spurred the machine into action. At the bottom of the hill, she pulled into an industrial estate, awash with to let signs, a stark testament to the area's industrial history, and a suitably barren area from which to make the phone call. Kim took out her phone. This was not a conversation that took place anywhere near Mikey's grave. She would not allow his final resting place to be contaminated by evil. She had to protect him, even now. The call was answered on the 3rd ring. "Nurse Taylor, please." The line went dead for a few seconds before she heard the familiar voice. "Hi, Lily, it's Kim Stone." The nurse's voice was warm. "Hi, Kim, it's lovely to hear from you. I thought you might call today." The nurse said the same thing every time, and yet it had never changed once. She'd made this call on the 12th of each month for the last 16 years. "How is she?" "She's had a quiet Christmas, but she seemed to enjoy the choir that visited." "Any violent episodes?" "No, not for a while now. Her medication is stable." "Anything else?" "She asked about you again yesterday. Although she has no concept of dates, it's almost like she knows when you're about to call." The nurse paused. "You know, if you ever wanted to come and—" "Thank you for your time, Lily." Kim had never visited, and never would. Grantley Psychiatric Clinic had been home to her mother since Kim was 6 years old, and it was where she belonged. "I'll tell her you called." Kim thanked her again and hit the end button. The nurse treated Kim's monthly phone calls as a welfare check to see how her mother was doing, and Kim had never informed her otherwise. Only Kim knew that she made the call to ensure that the murdering evil bitch was still safely behind bars. Chapter 11. Righty, update folks. Kev, what do we know from Miss Purrs? Professor Milton has just divorced for the 3rd time. A bit like Simon Cowell, all his exes have nothing but good to say about him. No natural children of his own, but stepfather to 5. No hostility noted. When did he go missing? Wednesday was the last time he was seen. His assistant at the college raised the alarm when he didn't appear on Thursday morning. He hasn't been in touch with any of his family members, which is apparently very strange. Anything to suggest he's done this before? Dawson shook his head. To hear the exes talk, he's a reincarnation of Gandhi, mild-mannered and gentle. Kev consulted his notes. The latest ex spoke to him on Tuesday afternoon, and he was excited that he finally had permission for the dig. "I've been looking into that, Gov," Stacey offered. "The original application made by Professor Milton was 2 years ago. There have been more than 20 objections to the project, environmental, political, cultural. I ain't got anything further on that yet." "Keep trying, Stace. Bryant, do we know exactly when our victims spoke to the professor?" Bryant held out a piece of paper. "Courtney faxed me the telephone log. They spoke for 12 minutes on Wednesday at around 5:30. Kim crossed her arms. "OK, so all we have so far is that our victim had a brief conversation with a university professor on Wednesday afternoon, and now one of them is dead and the other is missing." A knock sounded on the door. A constable stood in the doorway. "What?" she barked. She hated interruptions during briefing. "Ma'am, I have a gentleman at the desk who wants to speak to you." Kim looked at him as though he'd lost his mind. "I know, Ma'am, but he insists that he will only speak to you. He says he's a professor." Kim was out of her chair. "Bryant, with me," she said, stopping at the door. "Stace, find out whatever you can about this land." She headed out and took the stairs. Bryant almost kept pace with her. In the reception, she was greeted by a male with a full grey beard and a shock of wiry hair. "Professor Milton?" He stopped wringing his hands long enough to offer a handshake. Kim took his hand briefly and then gave it back to him. "Please, come this way." Kim guided him through the corridor to interview room 1. "Bryant, place a call to Miss Purse so they don't waste any more time. Is there anything we can get you?" "A sweet cup of tea." Bryant nodded and closed the door behind them. "A lot of people have been worried about you, Professor." She didn't intend for the words to sound like a rebuke, but she hated any waste of police time. Resources were scant enough. He nodded his understanding. "I'm sorry, Detective. I didn't know what to do. I only spoke to Mrs. Pearson a few hours ago and she told me about your visit. She said I could trust you." Kim was surprised that the old harridan had formed that opinion of her. "Where have you been?" she asked. It wasn't the question that rolled around in her mouth, but if Bryant had been beside her, he would have urged caution. The male was clearly trembling, and his hands had returned like magnets to each other. "Barmouth, at a bed and breakfast. I just had to get away." "But on Wednesday you were over the moon, Mrs. Pearson told us." He nodded as Bryant entered the room. His hands held a triangle of styrofoam. He sat and pushed one of the cups towards the professor. Kim continued. "You spoke to a woman by the name of Teresa Wyatt on that day?" Professor Milton looked confused. "Yes, Mrs. Pearson mentioned that you had asked about that, but I'm not sure how it relates to what happened to me later." Kim had no idea what had happened to him later, but she did know that Teresa Wyatt had turned up dead. "Can you tell us why Teresa Wyatt called you?" "Of course. She asked if I would be accepting any volunteers onto the project." "What did you say?" He shook his head. "No. I only accept volunteers who have completed at least 1 year at university. Miss Wyatt expressed an interest in the subject of archaeology, but hadn't completed any study and certainly wouldn't have been able to before the project commenced at the end of February." Kim felt herself deflate. This was not a lead that would help them uncover a killer. It was a harmless conversation. "Was there anything else?" Bryant asked. The professor paused. "She did ask whereabout we would be commencing the dig, which I found a little strange in the context of the conversation." Yes, Kim thought, that was a little strange. "What happened later?" she asked, recalling his previous comment. Professor Milton swallowed. "I got home from work, and Tess didn't greet me as she usually did." Kim looked at Bryant. Dawson said that the professor was single again. "Ordinarily, she sleeps in the kitchen next to her water bowl, but as soon as I put my key into the lock, she's there, wagging her tail." Ah, that made more sense, Kim thought. "But not Wednesday. I called her as I walked to the kitchen, but she didn't come. I found her next to her bed." He swallowed. She was convulsing on the floor. Her eyes were glassy and staring, and for a few seconds I didn't even see the note. I scooped her up and drove to the vet's as quickly as possible, but it was too late. She'd gone by the time I got there. He wiped his right eye. Kim opened her mouth to ask about the note, but Bryant cut her off. "So sorry to hear that, Professor. Had she been unwell?" Professor Milton shook his head. "Not at all. She was only 4 years old. The vet didn't need to examine her. He could smell the antifreeze on her breath. Apparently dogs love it because it tastes sweet. The chemical had been poured into her water dish and she'd drunk the lot." "You said there was a note?" Bryant prompted gently. His eyes reddened. "Yes, the bastard stapled it to her ear." Kim winced. "Do you recall what it said?" He reached into his jacket. "I have it here. The vet removed it afterwards." Kim took the note. Forensically, it would be of no use now. The professor had handled it, and so had the vet. She unfolded it and laid it out on the table. It was simple black type on white paper and read, "Kill the dig or wife number 3 will be next." I didn't even go back home. I'm ashamed to admit that I was terrified and still am. Who would do this, Detective? The professor drained the last of his tea. "I don't even know where I can go." "Mrs. Pearson," Kim offered. She'd seen the expression on the woman's face when she'd spoken of the professor. That little bulldog wouldn't let anyone near him. Kim stood and took the note while Bryant shook the man's hand and offered to get him a ride to wherever he wanted to go. Kim clutched the note and headed back to the office. She couldn't help feel that somewhere out there was one humongous can of worms and that she'd just been handed the can opener. "OK, Kev, I think we're going to need fresh coffee. Stace, what did you find out about that land?" "It's about an acre in size and sits right next to the Rowley crematorium. It's at the tip of a council estate built in the mid-50s. Before the housing development, it was the site of a steelwork factory." Bryant entered the room on his mobile phone. "Thank you, Courtney. You've been a wonderful help." "What?" Bryant asked, as 6 curious eyes landed on him. "Courtney," Kim asked, "is there something I need to drop to your wife?" Bryant chuckled as he removed his suit jacket. "I'm a happily married man, Gov. My wife said so. And anyway, Courtney is mending a broken heart courtesy of Joanna, the English teacher that was coming on to you the other day." Dawson turned, his eyes wide. "Really, Gov?" "Down, boy." She turned to Bryant. "Why the call?" Bryant raised an eyebrow. "Following your logic of past, present and future, I asked Courtney if she had access to Teresa Wyatt's employment history. She's faxing it over." "Put that girl on the Christmas list. She's saving us a fortune in warrants." Kim turned back to Stacey, trying to visualize the piece of land. "Hang on. Are you talking about that field right next to the crematorium, the one where the travelling fair sets up?" Stacey turned her monitor and pointed. An image from Google Earth filled the screen. "Look, there's something fenced off at the road edge, but otherwise it's just a waste piece of land." Kim's gut was now churning out of control. Every sense she possessed was on high alert. "Stace, look up the name Crestwood and get me everything you can. I have some calls to make." Kim took a breath as she sat at her own desk. A few pieces of the puzzle began to slide into place, and for the first time in her life, she hoped she was wrong. Chapter 12. Tom Curtis turned over and faced away from the window. The daylight didn't normally stop him from sleeping after an 8-hour shift at the care home. The work was exhausting. Picking up fat old people, putting them to bed, dabbing their spittle and wiping their arses. He'd already avoided 2 internal investigations, but he suspected that this third one might be more problematic. Martha Brown's daughter only visited once a week, and when she did, she was sure to notice the bruise. The rest of the staff had turned a blind eye. It was impossible not to lose patience now and again. Being the only male on the team meant he would often turn up for the night shift and find that the heavier jobs had not been done. He was powerless to complain. If he'd been honest on his medical form, he would not have a job at all. But it wasn't even his conscience that kept him awake. He felt nothing for the old folks under his care, and if their relatives were affronted, they could bloody well take them home and wipe the shitty arses themselves. No, it was the ringing of his mobile phone that was keeping him awake. Even though he'd switched it off, he could still hear it in his head. He turned and lay on his back, glad that his wife and daughter had already left the house. Today was going to be another dark day. The dark days had punctuated the last 2 years, 7 months and 19 days. It was on these days that the urge to drink was overpowering. It was on these days that sobriety was not worth his life. When he'd left culinary school, he had never envisaged that his future would consist of changing the nappies of old people. When he'd graduated, he had not foreseen old wobbly flesh around his neck as he lifted geriatrics in and out of bed. He had not dreamt that he would be hand-feeding a group of people who were filled with rigor mortis before they'd taken their last breath. At 23, he'd suffered his first heart attack, which had rendered him unemployable on the restaurant scene. Long hours and stressful working conditions were not conducive to the long life of a person with congestive heart disease. One day he'd been serving haute cuisine in a French restaurant on Water's Edge in Birmingham, and the next he'd been preparing turkey burgers and frozen chips for a bunch of worthless kids. For years he hid his addiction from his wife. He became a master of lies and deceit. On the day he collapsed with a second heart attack, his lies had been uncovered, when the doctor had advised that the next bender would most probably be his last. He had not taken a drink since that day. He reached across and switched on his phone. Immediately it began to ring. He hit the end button to cut off the call, taking the tally of missed calls to 57 in 3 days. He didn't recognise the number and no name displayed on the screen, but Tom knew who was calling. And the caller would have spent his time better had he tried to reach Teresa. It was obvious that she'd opened her mouth to someone and it had got her killed. He suspected that the authorization for the dig had made them all jittery, but he didn't need the check calls. He would keep their damn secrets just as they had kept his. They had made a pact. He knew that the others viewed him as the fragile connection in the chain of deceit, but he hadn't weakened yet. There had been times, especially on the dark days when he'd been tempted to speak out, to rid himself of the poison. Those thoughts had been more easily silenced by drink. His mind travelled back, as it did every day. Damn it, he should have said no. He should have stood up to the rest of them and said no. His own wrongdoing seemed so trivial compared to the consequences of his acquiescence. One time he'd found himself on the wall outside Old Hill Police Station. For 3.5 hours he remained there, chasing the tail of his conscience. He stood, he sat down, he paced, he sat down. He cried, he stood up, and then he walked away. If he'd been strong enough to tell the truth, he might have lost his wife. As a woman and as a mother, if she ever learned of his part in the events, she would be sickened by his actions. And the worst part was Tom couldn't blame her. He threw back the covers. There was no point trying to sleep. He was fully awake. He headed downstairs. He needed coffee, the stronger the better. He headed to the kitchen and stopped dead at the dining table. Staring at him was a bottle of Johnny Walker Blue and a note. The very sight of the golden brown liquid took the saliva from his mouth. The 40% proof bottle cost more than £100. It was one of the finest old-aged malt and grain whiskies, the Cristal of the blended whisky world. His body responded. It was like staring into Christmas morning. He tore his eyes away and reached for the note. "We can do this your way or my way, but it will get done. Enjoy." He slumped into the chair, his eyes fixed on his best friend and his worst enemy. It was clear what the sender wanted. They wished for him to die. Alongside his fear sat relief. He had always known that the day of reckoning would come, whether it be in this life or the next. Tom unscrewed the top of the bottle and the smell reached his nose immediately. He knew that to take a drink would kill him. Not the first sip. He was an alcoholic. There was no such thing as a sip. If he took a drink, he would finish the whole bottle and that would bring him death. If he chose this method to die, then no one else need suffer. His wife would think he'd simply weakened and she would be safe. With luck, she might never learn of what he'd done. His daughter need never know. He lifted the bottle slowly and took the first gulp. He paused only a second before raising the bottle to his lips again. This time he didn't stop until the scorch in his chest was unbearable. The effects hit him immediately. After more than 2 years, his body had lost tolerance, and the alcohol burned around his veins all the way to his brain. He took another swig and smiled. There were worse ways to die. He swigged again and chuckled. No more bathing old folks, no more dirty nappies, no more wiping dribble. He raised the bottle to his mouth, taking the liquid halfway down. His body was on fire and he felt euphoric. It was like watching your favourite football team slaughter the opposition. There would be no more hiding what he'd done, no more fear. He was doing the right thing. The tears dropped onto his cheeks. Inside, Tom felt happy, at peace, but his body was betraying him. The bottle paused at his mouth as his eyes rested on a photo of his daughter feeding the goats at Dudley Zoo on her 6th birthday. He squinted at the photo. He didn't remember that frown on her face or the questions in her eyes. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry," he said to the picture. "It was only once, I swear." Her expression didn't change. "Are you sure?" He closed his eyes against the accusation, but her face still swam before his eyes. "Okay. Maybe it was more than once, but it wasn't my fault, sweetheart. She made me do it. She tempted me. She teased me I couldn't help myself. It wasn't my fault." "But you were an adult?" Tom closed his eyes against the onslaught of his child's disgust. A tear forced its way out and slid down his cheek. Please understand, she was much older than 15. She was clever and manipulative, and I just gave in. It wasn't my fault. She seduced me and I couldn't fight back. She was a child. Tom pulled at his own hair to ease the pain. I know, but she wasn't a child. She was a conniving girl who knew how to get what she wanted. But what you did next was unforgivable. Daddy, I hate you. Now his whole body cried. He would never see his beautiful little girl again. He would not watch Amy grow into a young lady or be around to protect her from boys. He would never kiss those soft cheeks again or feel her tiny little hand in his. His head dropped forward and tears fell onto his legs. Through the blurred vision his gaze travelled to his feet and rested on the slippers Amy had bought him for Father's Day. They were monogrammed with the face of Homer Simpson, his favourite character. No, his mind screamed. There had to be another way. He didn't want to die. He didn't want to lose his family. He had to make them understand. Maybe he could go to the police, admit to what he'd done. It wasn't as though he'd been alone. He hadn't even been a decision-maker. He'd just gone along with it because he was young and scared. He'd been weak and stupid, but damn it, he was not a murderer. Of course he would be punished, but it would be worth it to be able to watch his daughter grow. Tom wiped the tears and focused his vision on the bottle. It was over half gone. Oh God, he prayed that it was not too late. As he placed the bottle back on the table, he felt his head being yanked back by the hair. The bottle fell to the floor as Tom tried to understand what was going on. He felt the cold tip of metal beneath his left ear, a forearm against his neck. He tried to turn, but the tip of the blade ripped at his skin. He watched as a gloved hand moved from left to right beneath his chin. And that was the last thing he saw. Chapter 13. Kim replaced the receiver after the third call. She hoped she was wrong, and that she was about to waste the valuable time of some very important people. She would happily accept a bollocking from Woody if she was wrong. She would get no satisfaction from being right on this one. Someone did not want that ground excavated. "What have you got, Stace?" Kim asked, perching on the edge of the spare desk. "Hope you're sitting comfy, Gov. The building that still stands is part of a bigger facility that was built in the 1940s. Back then it was designed to house the mentally disturbed soldiers returning from the war. The physically disabled were sent to various hospitals in the region, but the worst of the psychologically affected were sent to Crestwood. Really, it was a secure unit for the soldiers that could never go back into society. We're talking killing machines that ain't got an off button. By the late 70s, the population of about 35 individuals had either committed suicide or died of natural causes. The place was then used as a borstal. Kim cringed. It was an outdated word that brought all kinds of connotations. Go on. There's some real horror stories that came out of the 80s of abuse and molestation. An inquiry was carried out, but no charges were brought. By the early 90s, the place had been turned into a children's home for girls, but still had a reputation for housing troubled teens. Due to budget cuts and building repairs, the place was being phased out as we entered the millennium, and in 2004 there was a fire that emptied it completely. Anyone hurt? Stacey shook her head. There ain't no headlines to suggest it. OK, Kev, Stace, start compiling a list of staff members. I want to see... The sound of the fax machine kicking into life silenced her. They all knew what it was, and they all knew what it was going to say. Bryant reached for the document and perused it quickly. He stood behind Stacey's desk and handed her the CV of Teresa Wyatt. Here you go, guys. I think you have your first. Glances were exchanged between them all as the possibilities began to dawn. No one spoke. And then the phone rang. Chapter 14. Jesus, Gov, slow down. This is not a Kawasaki Goldwing. Good to know, because there's no such thing. You do know that we're too late to save him. Kim slowed as she approached an amber light, but thought better of it and sped over the lights of the Pedmore Road. She weaved in and out of vehicles on the dual carriageway that ran alongside the Merry Hill shopping centre. And that there's no siren on this. Oh, Bryant, loosen up, I haven't killed us yet. She offered him a sidelong glance. And you need to be more worried about the gash on your left arm. She'd spotted the injury through the fabric of his shirt sleeve during the briefing. Just a scratch. Rugby practice last night, he nodded. You really need to give it up. You're either too old or too slow for the game. Either way, you're going to get hurt. Thanks for that, Gov. Each injury is worse than the last, so surely it's time to pack it in. She was forced to stop the car at the next set of lights. Bryant unwrapped his left hand from the roof handle and flexed it. Can't do it, Gov. Rugby is my yang. Your what? My yang, Gov, my balance. The missus has got me taking ballroom dance classes with her every week. I need the rugby to balance me out. Kim negotiated the next traffic island from the inner lane and ignored the horn honks that sounded in her wake. So you prance around the dance floor and then hug other hairy men to balance you out? It's called a scrum, Gov. I'm not judging, honest. She turned and looked at him, fighting back the smile. What I don't really understand is why on earth you offered that information to me voluntarily. You have to know that was a mistake. He rested his head back against the seat, closed his eyes and groaned. Yeah, starting to see that now. He turned to her. You'll keep it between us, Gov, eh? She shook her head. Not going to make promises I can't keep, she answered honestly. So who were you calling earlier? He asked, changing the subject. Professor Milton. For what? Just making sure he'd reached Mrs. Pearson safely. Bollocks, Bryant said behind a cough. As the cars began to move away slowly, she shadowed the car in front. It braked and so did she as 3 lanes filtered into 2. Bryant grabbed the handle. So, what do we know? Male, late 30s, cutthroat, possible suicide, could be accidental. Kim groaned. A dark humour was necessary to maintain sanity, but just sometimes. Where now? Take a left just past the school and we should see it from there. Kim screeched around the corner, sending Bryant crashing against the passenger door. She drove up the hill and threw on the handbrake at the cordon. A box porch led straight into the front room, where a WPC sat on the sofa comforting a distraught female. Kim walked through directly into an open-plan dining room and kitchen. Jesus Christ, she whispered. No, that's just a rumour, said Keats. The male was still seated in the dining room chair. His limbs were limp like a rag doll. His head was torn back, the crown almost resting between his shoulder blades. Kim was instantly reminded of a cartoon. The angle looked almost impossible. The laws of physics dictated that he should have fallen to the floor, but the angle of the back of his neck over the top of the chair had kept him in place, the back of his head resting like a hook. The gaping wound displayed yellow, fatty tissue torn apart by a blade. Blood had spurted onto the wall opposite and drained down his chest, forming a macabre bib. His T-shirt and joggers were sodden red, and the stench of metal almost overwhelmed her. Jesus Christ, Bryant offered from behind. Keats shook his head. One of you needs to fire their scriptwriter. Kim ignored him as she committed the scene to memory. She stood above the body and looked down. The eyes of the male were open and wide. His face bore the expression of the horror below. She saw the empty bottle of whiskey on the floor. Alcohol at this time? She asked. I think half the bottle is inside him and the other half is in the carpet. It's a damn waste. Johnny Walker Blue sells for over 100 a bottle. Bryant, go on my way. Bryant turned and headed back to the lounge. He was much better with distraught females than she was. In her company they often cried more. She walked around the body, examining the scene from every angle. Nothing in the immediate area was disturbed, and no struggle seemed to have taken place. A white suit hovered around her. Detective, Keegan here is too polite to ask you to move, but I'm not, Keats said. Stand back so he can do his job. Kim shot Keats a look, but stepped back into the corner of the room. With satisfaction she noticed that the hem on his right trouser leg was down, but damn that smidge of decency that kept the observation on the right side of her lips. Keegan took digital photographs and then took out a disposable camera and repeated the process. His wallet is upstairs, so it wasn't robbery, Keats offered, standing beside her. Kim already knew that for a fact. Type of knife? I'd say plastic handle, 7-inch kitchen knife normally used for cutting bread. Detailed description for a prelim exam? He shrugged. Or it could just be the one in the sink covered in blood. He was murdered with his own damn bread knife? Detective, I wouldn't like to commit myself too early, but... He lowered his voice and leaned towards her. I'd hazard a guess that foul play was involved. Great, today everyone was a comedian. Method of entry. Patio door left open to let the cat in and out. Good to see the secure home campaign was successful. Kim stepped closer to the patio door. A technician stood outside dusting the handle. She studied every inch of the area. Her gaze paused and she crouched down. She assessed the back garden, a mixture of gravel and slabs. A clean fence lined the perimeter. Keats, who from this team was at Teresa Wyatt's house the other night? He glanced at the technicians present. That would be just myself. So it was just the two of them. Are you wearing the same shoes? Detective, my footwear. Keats, just answer me. He paused for a few seconds, now moving towards her. No, I am not. And neither was she. Look, she said, pointing. He squinted at the object, which was no more than an inch long. Golden conifer, he observed. Their eyes met as they both realised the repercussions of the discovery. Whiskey's a bit of a puzzle, Gov, Bryant said, appearing beside her. Our guy was a recovering alcoholic. Been on the wagon for about 2 years. The wife states that the bottle wasn't in the house this morning and he would never have left the house dressed like that. Also, he's got the same money in his wallet as he did when she left the house. She still checks. Kim stood and took an evidence marker from the tech bag. Why would the killer bring the whiskey? Bryant shrugged. Dunno. But he had congestive heart failure, so the whiskey would probably have been enough. Kim was puzzled. The murderer had brought a bottle of alcohol, somehow aware that it would probably prove fatal to Tom Curtis, but had almost beheaded him anyway. It made no sense. Our killer could have just delivered the bottle and left the scene, but that wasn't enough. Why? Sicko wanted to send a message? Either the killer knew of his heart condition but wanted to add the personal touch, or it was a tool to subdue him to make the job easier. Bryant shook his head as Kim's mobile phone rang. Stone. Gov, what's the full name of your victim? Tom Curtis. Why? She asked, hearing the breathlessness in Dawson's tone. Her stomach rolled at what she knew she was about to hear. You're not going to believe this, but there was a head chef at Crestwood Children's Home 10 years ago. His name was Tom Curtis. Chapter 15. Thanks for letting me drive back, Gov. My nerves couldn't take another roller coaster. Yeah, well, this ain't driving Miss Daisy, and I do want to get back to the station before next weekend. Bryant headed towards Hales Owen, and Kim took out her phone. She redialed a number she'd called earlier. Professor Milton? Yes, hello. About our discussion earlier, is everything in place? I've made some calls, my dear, and I think I can help with your request. I appreciate that, but we now appear to have a second body related to this case, and urgency is of the utmost importance. She heard his sharp intake of breath. It will be done, Detective. She thanked him and ended the call. What was that all about? Never mind, just keep driving. By the time Bryant pulled into the car park, she had called ahead to make a request for a briefing meeting with Woody, so she entered the building and headed straight for the 3rd floor. Kim knocked on Woody's door and entered just a second before he instructed her to do so. Stone, this had better be good. I was in the middle of... Sir, the Teresa Wyatt case is much more complicated than we first thought. How so? Kim took a deep breath. On the day she was murdered, our victim made a call to a Professor Milton who had just received authorization to excavate an area of land in Rowley Regis. She initially asked to be included in the project but was turned down. Then she became quite interested in the area concerned. What significance is in the land? It's the site of the old children's home. Next to the crematorium? Kim nodded. Both Teresa Wyatt and Tom Curtis are ex-staff members. In the few days since he was granted permission to excavate the land, the professor's life has been threatened and his dog killed, and 2 previous employees of Crestwood have been murdered. Woody stared at a spot on the wall behind her. He was already reading the headlines. Sir, someone does not want that ground disturbed. Stone, don't go at this at warp speed. There are a lot of politics involved. The equipment will be on site tomorrow. His jaw tensed. Stone, you know that's impossible. There are all sorts of things we need to do. With all due respect, sir, that's your worry, not mine. With the momentum this case is gathering, we really don't have the luxury of waiting that long. He considered her words for a moment. I want you on site first thing in the morning, and nothing gets dug. Not one shovel hits the earth until you get confirmation from me. Kim said nothing. Stone, do we understand each other? Of course, sir. Whatever you say. She stood and left the room. Chapter 16. Bethany Adamson cursed at the sudden noise in the stillness of the hallway. The metal grid between the elevator and the tiled floor clattered beneath her walking stick. She moved along the corridor, searching for the keys to the flat. With one hand she tried to single out the entrance key. The whole bunch fell to the ground, metal against metal. She swore as she bent to retrieve them. A pain shot from her knee to her thigh. Her hand closed around them, but not before she heard the deadbolt slide across the old cow's door. As Beth straightened, she felt the gush of warm air that came from the open door of their neighbour. "Is everything okay out here?" she asked. There was no concern in the question, only the hint of reprimand. Myra Downs stood about 5 feet high in her fur-trimmed slippers. The bare skin of her feet was scaly and dry. Beth thanked God that the woman was dressed in a full-length dressing gown. Her fleshy arms were folded across an ample breast, being flattened down like dog ears. Her lined face was creased in displeasure. Beth faced her squarely. Nicola might be frightened of the old cow, but she was not. "Nah, Mrs. Downs, I was just being raped and pillaged by 3 blokes, but thanks for your concern." The woman huffed. "There are people trying to sleep, you know." "You'd have a better chance if you weren't propped up against the door." The woman's face distorted like a bulldog chewing a wasp. "You know, before you came to stay, this floor was a perfectly respectable place, and now what with the arguing and the noise at all hours—" "Mrs. Downs, it's 10:30 and I dropped me keys. Get a fucking grip." The woman's face reddened. Well, how long do you intend to stay?" Yeah, another resident who didn't want to hear. Well, tough bloody luck. "Probably gonna stay a while. Nick's adding me to the lease." It was worth the lie to see the horror register on her face. "Oh, no, I'll be speaking to your sister about—" This nosy old bag was really starting to get on her nerves. "What the bloody hell is your problem?" "Loud noise late at night is frightening for single residents, young lady." "Who do you think's gonna get in? There's 3 locks and a key code to protect you." Beth looked her up and down. "And I don't think you got a lot to fear, to be honest." Mrs. Downs stepped back from the door. "I can't deal with you. I'll speak to Nicola. She's far more pleasant than you are." Tell me something I don't know, Beth thought. She continued to stare the old woman down until the door finally closed. She allowed herself a small smile. That little exchange had made her night. She jangled the keys a few more times before finally letting herself into the apartment. Beth placed the walking stick over the edge of the sofa and sat down. She rubbed at her knee. The cold was giving it murder. She reached for the slippers parked on the edge of the sofa. The maroon leather uppers were soft and smooth, the fur luxurious and warm. She took off the flat-heeled boots and eased her feet into the expensive footwear. They weren't hers, but Nicola wouldn't mind. They had always shared. That's what twins did. She stood and shook out the ache from her knee. She tapped on Nicola's door lightly. No answer. What had she been expecting? Of course her whore of a sister was not at home. She was out dancing and showing off her body for money. She opened the door and stepped in. As usual, the room took her breath away. It was the room they dreamt of as children, as they laid side by side at Crestwood. Their room would have matching pink covers and pillows. An awning would circle the beds, held in place by beautiful lace. They dreamed of a wardrobe as magical as Narnia. Shelves would be filled with stuffed toys and snow globes. Fairy lights would be draped around the head of both beds. Their imagined bedroom would be magical and light and filled with things that were theirs, and they would drift off to sleep, making shadows on the wall. Beth stepped further into the room. Her hand trailed along the shelf above the fireplace and landed on the single brown teddy bear at the end. She opened the door to the walk-in closet and stepped inside. Nicola's clothes, underwear and shoes were folded, stacked and organised according to colour. 2 drawers were dedicated to jewellery. One drawer held expensive, delicate pieces stored in their original boxes. Beth spotted one from Cartier and 2 from De Beers. The second held bolder, heavier pieces that Beth guessed were used for her work. She closed the drawer quickly and moved further along. She didn't like to think of her sister at work. A dressing table separated the wardrobe from the shoe cupboard. A single strand of clear fairy lights lined the mirror's edge. Beth returned to the bedroom and sat on the four-poster bed. It was a room fit for a princess, just as they'd planned. It was the place they had vowed to live together forever and ever. It was the room of which they dreamed, except there was only one bed. One bed to be enjoyed by the sister who had it all. What Nicola had didn't anger Beth anywhere near as much as her sister's refusal to admit what she'd done. Her pathetic denial of their past infuriated Beth more and more with each passing day. No apology could ever take it back. Nicola's actions had destroyed their chances of any life together, and still she maintained her ignorance of the facts. "I don't know why you hate me. I don't know what I've done. I don't know how I hurt you." On and on and on with the denial. However much Nicola protested otherwise, Beth felt the truth in her heart. Somewhere deep inside, she knew. Chapter 17. "Jesus, Bryant, will you keep still?" He moved from foot to foot. The overnight temperature had dropped to -3, and the ground still held an icy core that seeped up through the shoes and into the bones. He blew warm breath into his cupped hands. "For those of us not made of titanium, it's cold enough to freeze the balls off a brass monkey." "Man up," Kim said, walking to the edge of the site. The area itself was the size of a football pitch. It rose gently towards a row of trees that obscured the north tip from the council estate. On the west side there was a road separating the site from the Rowley Regis crematorium. The remains of a large building sat at the southern edge nearest the road, behind a bus stop and a street lamp. The upper floor peered over a row of terraced houses on the other side of the road. A 6-foot fence formed a snug perimeter around the structure, obscuring the lower level from view. She glanced to the west and shook her head. How comforting for kids that had been abandoned, abused and neglected to look out of their window onto a field for the dead. There were times when the insensitivity of the system appalled her. It was a building that had become vacant, and that was all that had mattered. She sighed and blew a kiss to Mikey's grave, which now lay behind a curtain of mist, sealing them off from the rest of the world 200 feet in each direction. A Volvo estate pulled onto a dirt patch at the top of the site. Kim walked over as Professor Milton and 2 men exited the vehicle. "Detective, good to see you again." Kim saw a remarkable change in the demeanour of the professor since the previous day. His cheeks were rosy and his eyes bright. His gait was sprightly and purposeful. If that was after one night in the care of Mrs. Pearson, she might consider booking in herself. He turned to his companions as Bryant materialised beside her. "This is Darren Brown and Carl Newton. They're volunteers that were scheduled to assist on my dig. They'll be operating the equipment." Kim felt obliged to come clean with the professor after the trouble he had taken. "You know this is a hunch, Professor. There may be nothing down there." His eyes were serious and his voice low. "But what if there is, Detective? I've been trying to excavate this land for 2 years and someone has done their level best to stop me. I'd like to know why." Kim was satisfied that he understood. A Vauxhall Astra pulled in beside the professor's car. A portly male in his 50s got out of the car, followed by a tall red-headed woman Kim guessed to be in her late 20s. "David, thank you for coming," Kim said. "I don't recall there being a great deal of choice, Detective," he said with a half smile. "Professor Milton, please meet Dr. Matthews." The 2 men shook hands. Kim had met Dr. David Matthews at the University of Glamorgan, which, together with Cardiff University and South Wales Police, formed a unique organisation in the UK called the University's Police Science Institute. It was dedicated to research and training in police-related matters. Dr. Matthews was an advisor for the Glamorgan Centre for Police Sciences and had been instrumental in setting up the crime scene investigation house at the university. Kim had attended a seminar there 2 years earlier and had offered a couple of suggestions for improvement to the scenario training based on her own crime scene experience, which had resulted in her staying on for the weekend. "May I introduce Cerys Hughes? She is a fully qualified archaeologist and has just completed a degree in forensic science." Kim nodded in her direction. "OK, it's important that you both understand that we have no authority here as yet. My boss is working on the red tape, so nothing can be disturbed until the paperwork is in order. If you suspect the presence of anything at all, let me know." David Matthews stepped forward. "You have 3 hours of our time for these shenanigans, and if nothing is detected by then, we will be on our way." Kim nodded. 3 hours of his time for 2 days of hers. Yep, that seemed fair. He continued. "Keris and I will cut a small feature at the top of the land to begin analysing the soil." Kim nodded towards Keris. The fiery red hair was cut in a sleek bob that rested just below a square jawline. Her pale blue eyes were piercing, not naturally beautiful. She had a face that was intriguing, that drew attention. The woman acknowledged her without smiling and followed David as he walked towards the top edge of the site. A white escort van took the last space on the dirt patch. A woman opened the rear doors. A steaming urn and foil-wrapped packages were inside. Bryant chuckled. "Did my imagination just conjure her up?" "No, she's real. Make sure everyone gets a hot drink and a bacon sandwich before they start." Bryant smiled. "You know, Gov, at times—" Kim didn't hear the rest of his words, as she was already heading down the hill towards the derelict building. She walked the perimeter of the fence, but there was no access point. The front of the building faced onto the road and the houses opposite. Too many prying eyes. She returned to the rear and started looking for an area of vulnerability. The fencing was not a traditional design of slatted pieces overlaying each other. Each panel was made of strong, thick wood normally used for pallets and lay flush with the one above and below. A tiny sliver of daylight escaped between each 9-inch piece. She pushed at one of the tall wooden fence posts. It moved back and forth, the bottom of the post rotted in the ground. "Don't even think about it, Gov," Bryant said, offering her a hot drink. She took it in her left hand and continued to work her way along the posts. The next 2 were steady, but the 4th rocked to and fro. "How did you get Dr. Matthews here? Did you bully him?" "Define bullying," she said, pushing at the next post. "Probably best I don't know. Plausible deniability and all that. It doesn't hurt to have the presence of a forensic archaeologist on site." "Course not, except that at this point we have no authorization to instruct anyone to do anything." Kim shrugged. "What if there's nothing down there?" "Then we all get to go home for tea. But if there is, we have a head start. Dr. Matthews is fully qualified to—" "Oh, I know. He's just given me his entire education history. But Woody said nothing is to be touched until the paperwork is in order." "See, now you're just being pedantic." "Just trying to protect your arse, Gov. My arse is fine. You should worry more about your own if you're planning to eat that second bacon bap in your pocket." "How did you know?" Kim shook her head. Because he would have brought one down for her, even though he knew she probably wouldn't touch it. She stood away from the fence and drained her coffee cup. "Now, more importantly, should I go over or through?" Bryant groaned. "How about away from it?" "Not one of the options I gave." "You have no authority to enter. Either help me or leave me to it. Your choice." She set the empty cup on the ground as Bryant sighed heavily. "If you try to go through, you'll be leaving the area vulnerable for kids." "Over it is then," Kim said, heading for the middle section of slats between the 2 stable fence posts. She aimed a kick at one of the panels level with her thigh. It splintered. She kicked it again and the panel cracked in half. She pushed the broken slats inward so the stable piece below could be used as a step. In one fluid movement, she put the toe of her left boot on top of the slat and used Bryant's shoulder to push herself up. She grabbed the stable post to her left, threw her right leg over the top of the fence and into the gap on the other side. As she straddled the top of the fence, she took a second to steady her balance before bringing her left leg over the top and into the gap. She jumped down backwards, bending her knees to absorb the impact. The grass around the building was tall and full of nettles. Kim navigated her way to the only cracked window she could see on the ground floor. The height of the fencing had protected the lower windows, but all the glass on the upper level had been smashed through. She spied a grey tin rubbish bin. She removed the lid and smashed it against the damaged window pane. "What the hell are you doing?" Bryant called. She ignored him and knocked out another couple of pieces of glass, and then took the bin, turned it upside down and stood on it. She carefully folded herself in through the broken window onto a Formica unit top that rang the entire end of the wall, pausing only for a double sink. She looked inside and saw the fire-damaged walls of the kitchen. Kim read that the fire had originated in there. The walls were blackest near the door that led into the corridor. Cobweb curtains adorned every corner of the room. From somewhere in the building, she could hear the sound of water dripping. The water supply would have been turned off at the stop tap. She guessed it was residual rainwater from a roof damaged by fire and time, now exposed to the elements. As she stood in the doorway, she saw that the corridor ran the length of the building, splitting it in half. When she looked to her right, the walls were painted and off-white. A film of dust was visible in places, but was untouched by the fire. To her left, the wooden beams supporting the floor above were exposed and blackened. The door frames were charred, and only a few patches of paint remained on the walls at low level. Wires and cables hung exposed from between the beams. Debris and fallen ceiling tiles littered the corridor floor. The damage appeared to worsen as it travelled further towards the edge of the building. Kim stepped back into the kitchen and surveyed the damage again. The wall units closest to the door were mottled with the marble effect of scorched wood. The doors of the fridge and freezer had buckled and were hanging off, but the area closest to the 6-ring cooker sat beneath a light covering of soot. She opened the door of the wall unit closest to the cooker. Rodent droppings fell onto the hob. A piece of A4 paper was tacked on the inside of the door. The print was still visible. It listed the names of girls on the left-hand side and a grid indicating the allocated chore for the week. Kim paused for a moment. Her hand reached up and touched the first few names. She had been one of these girls. Not here and not then, but subconsciously she knew every single girl on the list. She knew their loneliness, their pain, their anger. Kim was suddenly struck by a memory from foster family number 5. In the small box room at the back of the house, she would hear gentle cuckooing all through the night from the house next door. Each time the racing pigeons were released, she would watch them, willing them to fly away, escape their captivity and be free. But they never did. Places like Crestwood were the same. Occasionally the birds would be set free, but they always seemed to fly back. Like prison, release from a children's home came with farewells that held hope and good wishes, but never finality. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a siren in the distance. She clambered onto the work surface and bent herself through the window onto the top of the bin and down onto the ground. She dragged the bin to the fence just as the siren and the car engine died. "Morning, Kelvin, why the blues?" Bryant shouted. Kim rolled her eyes and stood against the fence. "Had a report that someone was seen inside the building." Great, the police were here for her. Bryant chuckled. "Nah. It's just me snooping around. Caught a shit job today babysitting this bloody digging crew, and I was just curious about what was behind here." "But you've not been in the building?" the constable asked doubtfully. "No, mate, how stupid do you think I am?" "Fair enough, detective. I'll leave you to it." The constable began to walk away, but then turned and took a couple of steps back. "Shit job from your boss, detective?" he asked. "Who else?" "Gotta tell you, sir, you have the condolences of most of the station having to work with that ball breaker." Bryant chuckled. "You know, if she could hear you, she'd probably agree." "She is a bit cold, though, eh?" Kim nodded from behind the fence. Yeah, she was happy with that. "Nah, she's not as bad as you think." Kim almost growled. Yes, she really was. "In fact, she was only saying the other day that it would be nice if you guys struck up conversation with her now and again." She'd bloody kill Bryant. Slowly. "No problem, sir. I'll bear that in mind." As the constable walked away, he transmitted back to the control room that the premises were all in order. "Bastard!" Kim spat through the fence. "Oops, sorry, Gov. Didn't realise you were there, listening." Kim stood on the bin and exited the area the same way she'd entered. She landed on her feet but fell into Bryant and knocked him sideways. "Oh, sorry," she said. On the scale of genuine apologies, I'd rate that at -7. "Detective," the professor said, appearing beside them, "we're ready to begin." Bryant caught her gaze and held it as the professor turned and walked away. "So, did you learn anything on your illegal fact-finding mission?" Contrary to the written report, that fire did not start in the kitchen. Chapter 18. Kim caught up with the professor as he neared Bill and Ben, as she had nicknamed his volunteers. Dr. Matthews has done an initial survey of the soil to find there is a large clay content. Not much of a surprise in the Black Country. Such conditions affect the performance of ground-penetrating radar, so we're going to start with a magnetometer. "Gesundheit," Bryant offered. The professor ignored her colleague and carried on speaking to her as though she had a clue. Kim rarely questioned the expertise of others. She trusted people to do their jobs effectively, and she expected the same in return. The magnetometer uses sensors to measure the gradient of the magnetic field. Different materials can cause disturbances, and this particular tool can detect anomalies caused by disturbed soils or decayed organic materials. Bill started walking towards them with Ben behind. To Kim, he looked like something from the Terminator. Over his shoulder rested a black strap fixed to a metal rod approximately 6 feet in length that he held horizontally at waist height. On the front tip of the pole was a second rod fixed so he carried a giant letter T. Attached to each end of the smaller rod were sensors. Black cables travelled to the reader strapped around his waist, and a black canvas holdall was fixed to his back. "We'll start down there at the bottom edge and work in straight lines, a bit like how you'd mow the lawn." Kim nodded, and the three of them moved away. Dr. Matthews and his assistant had retreated to the warmth of the car. "You going to be okay with this, Gov?" Bryant asked. "Why wouldn't I be?" she snapped. "Well, you know." "No, I don't know, and if you feel the need to question my capability, take it to my boss." "Gov, I would never do that." It was a question asked out of concern. "I'm fine, now leave it alone." She never talked about her past, but Bryant knew she'd spent time in the care system. He didn't know the things that had happened to her there. He knew she had a mother who was a paranoid schizophrenic, but he didn't know the repercussions of that. He knew she'd once had a twin brother, but he didn't know how he died. Only one person knew all the events of her past, and she was damn sure it was going to stay that way. The phone in her pocket rang. It was Woody. "Sir?" she answered expectantly. "Still waiting, Stone. I'm just checking that you remember what we talked about." "Of course, sir." "Because if you act against my instructions—" "Sir, please, you can trust me." Bryant shook his head. "If I don't have the authorization in the next couple of hours, stand Professor Milton down and thank him for his time." "Yes, sir," she said. Thank God he didn't know about Dr. Matthews. "I know it's frustrating standing around doing nothing, but processes have to be followed. I understand, sir. I have Bryant here who would like to express his concern about something to do with the handling of the case." She held out the phone. Bryant shot her daggers before walking away. "Oh no, I appear to be mistaken." Woody tutted and ended the call. She keyed in Dawson's number. He answered on the second ring. "What have you got?" "Not much at the moment, Gov." "Got the names of other staff members?" "Not yet. The local authority isn't quite as accommodating as Courtney. We're trawling through any news reports where Crestwood is mentioned to see if we can come up with anything. The best we've got so far is a Pastor Wilkes who did a sponsored walk of the 3 Peaks to raise money for a day trip for the girls. OK, Kev, pass me to Stacey." "Morning, Gov." "Stace, I need you to start putting together a list of the kids that were here when the place burned down." Even if there was nothing found, they would still need to speak to ex-residents of the facility to find a link between Teresa Wyatt and Tom Curtis. Stacey said she would get right on it and ended the call. Kim glanced towards the boys. They had progressed about 40 feet with the magnetometer, but were now standing still, checking the equipment. Her wandering gaze found Bryant at the edge of the site, his back to her. Uncharacteristically, she felt bad for snapping at him. She knew his question was born out of concern for her well-being, but she didn't react to kindness all that well. "Hey, you still got that bacon bap?" she asked, nudging him in the arm. "Yeah, you want it?" "No, go through it in that bin. Your cholesterol level can't take it." As soon as the words were out of her mouth, she realised that it worked both ways. "You been talking to my missus?" Kim smiled. She'd received a text message 2 days earlier. Kim heard movement and looked back. The professor was approaching at speed. His face was reddened, his features animated. "Detective, the machine is showing readings of interest. I think we might have something." Bryant caught her eye. "Gov, we don't have any authority." She looked at him for a long minute. If there was a body buried in this ground, it was not going to stay there a minute longer than necessary. She nodded to the professor. "Start digging."